So I'm Gordon Haff. I work for Red Hat. I'm our cloud evangelist, or one of them. I actually work across all of our cloud products, so not really going to talk about product here. I'm sure all of you are really disappointed this isn't going to be a product pitch. But I work across basically our infrastructure as a service work, our cloud forms, enterprise cloud, hybrid cloud management. Obviously, we had a recent announcement around what we're doing with OpenStack, the OpenStack Foundation, of course, OpenShift, that there's been lots of news about here. So I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly, and if anybody has questions, like it, be interactive. But just some of the things that I kind of see going on in clouds, and some of this may be a little bit provocative, and feel free to take issue, and we can have discussion. So going to go through 5 things here. And first thing I think has been really kind of interesting to me the last couple of years is I actually came out of the IT industry analyst community, and I've been with Red Hat for a couple of years. And I actually find it kind of striking how rapidly a lot of the thinking around cloud computing has evolved, and really is in fact continuing to evolve. When I think a guy by the name of Nick Carr wrote a book called The Big Switch, I think probably about 4 years or so ago, and the thesis of this book was that cloud computing was essentially going to replace on-premise IT. Werner Vogel's at Amazon, you've heard quoted here liberally this week, might still agree with that. But I think really, as many of these discussions here have sort of pointed out, is really there's a lot, is people are still thinking about computing, and in some cases it's going to be hosted, but it's certainly not IT doesn't matter, which was really Nick Carr's approach to this idea of the big switch. But what has happened is public clouds have really set a benchmark. They've really set sort of a goal that IT has had to aim for. A lot cheaper VM hours, a lot more efficiency. Developers can go on, with a credit card or not in many cases, get access to compute resources and kind of get on with their jobs. So the question then comes to the IT department, why can't you do that? And there are a lot of reasons why IT departments have to do things differently than public cloud providers. There's all this compliance and SLAs, and you need to worry about how you interact with large data, and there's just lots of requirements in enterprise IT shop that may not be present with a new style cloud application. But those expectations are nonetheless there. And I would kind of posit that the point that we're in with cloud computing right now, a lot of it has to do with how do we reconcile these two worlds. That, we can't throw everything out. We can't just turn off all the IT we have. They're driving business processes. But at the same time, we need to bring that forward into the new world, as well as developing all the incredible new applications that are possible by these cloud computing services, cloud computing APIs, and so forth. This next slide I'm going to show you is really kind of how I think a lot of people in the industry are starting to think about sort of the future of IT in the bigger picture. Sometimes I think cloud computing is a little bit hard, presents some definitional challenges, shall we say, because it does cover a lot of different things. But this slide here is, I think, how a lot of people are starting to think about how cloud fits in with some other big trends, and kind of really what cloud computing in sort of the big sense is. And in this sense, I think about cloud computing as this is sort of how we process information. It brings up things like the standardization of processor architectures, things like Moore's Law, things like open source software with these very large scale computing architectures, having automation, basically being able to handle things at scale, basically how we build and operate data centers at massive scale. And you bring all those things together along with some of the associated application aspects, and that's sort of what cloud computing is. We kind of pair that with the data, and a lot of this is ultimately about the data. One of the earlier panels here, one of the questions kind of was what's more important, the APIs or the data the APIs are accessing. And I think the fairly obvious answer is at some level, those are both very important things. And there's obviously a lot going on in big data. First of all, lots of information is just being made available because so much is digitized. There's lots of statistics out there. There's more data created every year than has been created since the beginning of time or something like that. All these new kind of database and semi-database architectures, caching architectures, non-relational databases. This question of do we have do we need models to do this analysis, or do analytics just kind of make the information insights just come out of that data? Scale-out storage models. One of the reasons Red Hat acquired a company called Gluster, which is scale-out software-based storage, because the distributed storage architecture is very important here. Traditional enterprise SANs don't cut it. And then you have how all this stuff is accessed, and mobility, and the obvious consumerization of IT, tablets, smartphones, all that kind of stuff. But it's also this idea of pervasive sensors, that all of this data is fed into here and analyzed here. So this is kind of how, not just myself, but I think a lot of other people are starting to think of as a framework for where stuff's headed. We've talked about openness a lot here, so I'm not going to spend too much time now. But really, one of the things we see with open and hybrid is ultimately this ability to span silos, kind of put users in control, to span different types of infrastructure to prevent lock-in. This isn't just open source. Some of you may have heard some of the discussion in an earlier panel. Though I would argue that open source can be a pretty significant enabler of a lot of these other things. But as we've seen with groups like OpenStack here, having that viable independent community is also important. I mean, an open source project that nobody is working on and contributing to, it's open, it's also not very useful. And I think that's, and so I think a number of, that open source isn't just about, kind of viewing code, game over, task over. And in fact, obviously we had our OpenShift open sourcing announcement yesterday. And I think some people ask us, well, why did this take so long? You just released the code. But in fact, working on doing that right and developing communities around it, as OpenShift has done, are really important in order to make having that open source code actually useful to somebody. And these are just some other characteristics as well. And this is the type of list. It's not that anybody is going to have a perfect score here, and you're going to have to balance sort of openness against functionality and other things. Sometimes we're going to make trade-offs. But I think these are types of things that I just suggest that people look at and consider when they're making decisions. From Red Hat's perspective, these are just a few of the upstream communities that we work with. In addition to the now open source OpenShift code, OpenStack, the Delta Cloud. David Luttercourt gave a talk earlier about this cross-cloud API. And we also have upstream communities like Aeolus and Catello. They're associated with our cloud forms, hybrid cloud management. One of the areas that we still hear a lot of discussion with around cloud computing is around the whole security and compliance area. Is it safe? And I think a lot of this discussion comes down to, if you would, kind of old-time thinking about how security happens with applications and data centers. To stereotype a little bit, the traditional data center security model, the security model overall was you had this 19th century fort with really thick, hard walls. You were in there, they were out there, and the goal was to keep them out there and you keep some nice big cannons aimed at them. Of course, I think today, first of all, it's not just about security, or arguably even predominantly about security. It's about compliance and risk mitigation, all kinds of things like that. The other thing is there's no inside and outside any longer. There's been a lot of talk here about APIs, for example. And APIs are ultimately, at some level, exposing your internal infrastructure to partners or maybe the general public. And yeah, firewalls still have a place here and there, but ultimately it's a much more complicated topic. And again, ultimately a lot of what we're doing here is balancing enterprise operations with cloud, with sort of this cloud agility. So you have these sort of go slow, do things right, do governance properly, and balancing that in a world where you also want to do things really quickly. Because frankly, if an enterprise today lets themselves be totally dominated here, so this side of the seesaw kind of goes down, yeah, they may avoid risk from these perspectives, but guess what? They're really they're certainly increasing their business risk of not being agile enough and not being competitive against other vendors in their space. Because it's really pretty amazing when you look at a lot of examples these days where businesses in industries you didn't traditionally think of as being high-tech or IT-centric, you look and go, wow, they're doing some really clever stuff that's fundamentally enabled by IT. I was reading an example just the other day of a business, of a company that made a business out of having internet-enabled pay laundry machines to let people know when there was a machine available in their apartment complex so they could go down and put their laundry in. And this is like a multi-million-dollar company. And they made their business out of technology in an industry that is not, shall we say, a VC sweetheart industry in Silicon Valley. And as I say, it's not security, it's really all these other things as well to think about. And one of the aspects of this is that we kind of talk a lot about building clouds. Is really also about very much about the application lifecycle management within those clouds, and particularly in enterprise context, is not just putting like developer self-service up on a cloud somewhere, but if it's going to be part of an enterprise application portfolio, also having the ongoing management of those applications going forward. So not just designing and building them and putting them into a cloud, but also doing the ongoing lifecycle management of those applications. And finally, there's a lot of, we're in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of talk about technology here, but adopting a cloud really from an enterprise perspective, and I cover all of our cloud products at Red Hat, but I probably have a bit more of a focus on specifically what we are doing for our enterprise customers and kind of what their needs are what their needs are for cloud. And there's not one size fits all. Many are looking to, for instance, adopt a hosted PaaS for some portion of their application portfolio. But I spent a lot of time talking to enterprises about kind of their overall cloud needs. And really, kind of the way we sort of think about this. And by the way, I do need to give some credit to Kurt Milne here with the IT Process Institute. He's co-author of a book called Beyond Building Private Clouds, and really it talks, as I'll get to in the next slide, about really adopting a cloud. One of the way it differs from virtualization management is you serve in physical systems, you did consolidation of those physical systems with virtualization, and really, obviously, virtualization became a really big thing because the dot-com bubble had burst, and we had all these, in many cases, underutilized Windows systems, and virtualization was essentially this kind of container or packaging technology that let us get the utilization of. But fundamentally, from a management point of view, you're still talking about managing individual servers as individual instances. They just happen to be virtual ones rather than physical ones. And in many cases, you have a lot more of them, which actually makes your management harder rather than easier. And yes, there are various virtualization management that automates in various ways, may provide some limited self-service. But I would argue that when you get to cloud, it's really a change in mindset that really goes beyond the level of change in technology. So you do have this automation, but you also have this idea of starting to think in terms of delivering services. This gets into the almost idea of everything being an API eventually. But even if you're not quite at that point initially, it's thinking not so much in terms of individual machine instances, but really what is the service catalog that's being self-service delivered to end users. And this is the process that Kurt came up with. This idea of cutting through the cloud clutter, basically figuring out what's going on here. There's a lot of hype going on. You're coming to events like this. You're learning. You're thinking about this PaaS model, IaaS, what's right for you in what areas of the company. Start getting your hands dirty, do a pilot, sort of learn what's going on. And then you get into this designing your service catalogs. What are the environments you will present to your users? Where is it appropriate to run different types of applications? What are your governance requirements that are associated with applications that touch customer data, for example? How do you assure consistency across these different environments? And then you really get into more optimization. So 2, you're sort of setting things up. 3, you're really starting to optimize it a bit more. And you're learning throughout this entire process. And then 4 is where you really get more of a business alignment. This cloud, like these other things, kind of starts out as more of a IT-driven type of project. But as you get here, you're really getting more towards what kind of business results can I produce. I kind of gave that example of the laundry machines earlier. And the fact of the matter is that even for large enterprises, maybe especially for large enterprises, it's increasingly becoming the job of the CIO to work with business units and say, not just how can I cut costs, but if I could deliver these type of mobile services to you, would that be useful for our business? Would that bring in more revenue? And then comes full circle. It's never over because you're basically measuring and refining throughout this entire process. What I'm kind of talking about here, is obviously goes beyond kind of ad hoc cloud development, although that can sort of happen outside of a mainstream IT process. But really, as cloud computing becomes just how computing is done, it does need to be thought of as part of an overall enterprise architecture as opposed to something that's done off in the side. Some of the best practices that we've found as companies are starting to do this is working cooperatively with users. We're not trying to take away your self-service Amazon access. We want to understand why you're using that, what types of other services could IT provide. In many cases, it makes sense to look at how you can provide that consistent environment between on-premise and off-premise. Favor approaches that maximize ability to vote with your feet. This is sort of the portability that we've talked about here. Avoid lock-in. Want to be able to move from one environment to another when you can. Sometimes a software as a service environment that really is vendor specific is going to make sense for your business. Obviously, lots of large enterprises, including Red Hat, actually use Salesforce.com, which, yes, you can export your data, but no, that's not going to be an easy migration away. But you can make the decision that, yeah, they have a good track record, and I'm willing to make that trade-off of using them even though I can't move to another Salesforce. But obviously there are going to be certain issues you can't compromise on. And ultimately, it's about balancing risk and reward. And cloud computing can provide lots of benefits. And if you worry too much about the risk of, well, what if this rare event could possibly happen that might have a minor effect on my business, but not doing it will basically keep me from being competitive? Well, you might well give the reward, might kind of well balance the reward a little bit higher there. So that is all I have, and happy to take any questions. Anything? Oh, good. I think we're getting closer to being back on schedule. So, thank you.